I've always said that the mini invasion into Kursk was probably phase one of a number of other operations that they'll do, because once the Ukrainians had wrestled the momentum and severely embarrassed Vladimir Putin, they'll want to keep that momentum. So this Belgorod incursion could well be the next phase.
Ukrainian forces have begun a fresh attack on Russia's border, this time in the Belgorod region. The head of the army says they've occupied an area of more than 500 square miles, including 100 Russian settlements. Let's speak to Colonel Philip Ingram, who's a former British military intelligence officer, a NATO planner and defence analyst. Philip, good evening.
Good evening.
Really interesting, this strategy, isn't it? And I suppose moving sort of east southeastward, as it were, coming in behind Kharkiv. What do you assess the strategy to be?
It is. Well, the reporting on the incursion today into Belgorod is very scant. So exactly how much they've achieved is not clear. They are reinforcing what's happened in Kursk. Belgorod is east of Kursk, and it is the region that the Ukrainians, through their Russian Legion, had a couple of small incursions into in the last year. And the Russian Legion are Russian nationals, but who are fighting for Ukraine and have their own formation as part of the Ukrainian military. And they attacked into Belgorod a couple of times, embarrassing the Russians. And that was, I think, in preparation for the much larger Kursk incursion that we've seen over the last 2 and a bit weeks.
There was a suggestion, wasn't there, Philip, that actually what they'd achieved already may be a stretch, holding it would be a stretch, that eventually, perhaps quite quickly, they would have to, a bop on the nose for Russia, but eventually they would have to retreat. As it stands, further advancements.
Well, it is a risk for the Ukrainians, but this is not something that you would do lightly. It's not something you do off the cuff. They will have planned this very carefully indeed. They will know where their limit of exploitation is from a concentration of their own troops perspective, from what they can logistically support. And I've always said that the mini invasion into Kursk was probably phase one of a number of other operations that they'll do, because once the Ukrainians had wrestled the momentum and severely embarrassed Vladimir Putin, they'll want to keep that momentum. So this Belgorod incursion could well be the next phase. They've also destroyed the bridges across the River Seam to the west of Belgorod, or where they've gone into Belgorod and isolated Russian troops out of there, and they've destroyed a couple of Russian pontoon bridges that have been put across to try and give an escape route either for the Russian troops out of where they're trapped or allow reinforcements to come in. It would not surprise me if the Ukrainians go further west as well, and we start to see them creating a bigger buffer zone of Russian territory.
How important is a buffer zone not a million miles away from Kharkiv?
Well, what it's doing is it is putting more pressure on the Russian forces that have come back into the Kharkiv area. And that in turn is putting pressure on the Russian forces that are still having some success in the east of Ukraine. And it's quite worrying. They're very close to some important towns and villages, and which are important from a logistic perspective in the east. So I think the Ukrainians were hoping that their attack into Kursk would take that pressure off a little bit more. Belgorod may be another attempt to do that, because what they were doing in the east and trying to defend against the Russians wasn't having as much success as they had hoped. And instead of banging your head against the brick wall and hoping the brick wall is going to fall down by doing the same thing all of the time, they've done something completely different by doing this left and northern hook up into Belgorod, and more importantly into Kursk.
There's also a suggestion that it's sort of stiffening resistance against those Ukrainian forces who have crossed the border, which could be particularly important when we consider the Donbass.
Yes, the Ukrainians. This has been a massive morale shot in the arm for the Ukrainians, both civilians and military. The Russians have been slow to react, and have had difficulty in stopping the Ukrainian advances in Kursk. The Russians are, and it seems that Putin is reluctant to withdraw his forces from the east to come around and deal with the incursion. And he's redoubling his efforts into the east as they try to take. There's a particular village called Pokrovsky, and I've probably mispronounced that. My colloquial Ukrainian with an Ulster accent isn't particularly good, but that's a logistic hub. It's a hub where there's a real way lines get in there, a real depot. It's a conjunction of different roads. The Ukrainians got a large logistic base in it, and the Russians are aiming towards that to try and capture that area and impact the Ukrainians' defense in the east. So this is a balancing game. But the Ukrainians know that, and they will have carefully planned what they're doing, and they will have worked out what their next steps are. So they're watching this very closely indeed. I've got every confidence that the Ukrainians are playing a masterstroke again.
Okay, Philip, thank you for your time tonight and your insight. Appreciate it. Colonel Philip.
Thank you.
Thank you. Colonel Philip Ingram is a former British military intelligence officer and a former NATO planner.
Ukraine's president has said that his troops' incursion into Russia's Kursk region is part of a victory plan that he will present to US President Joe Biden next month. This comes as the country is hit by another wave of Russian strikes, only a day after what is being regarded as the biggest air attack of the war, which left 6 dead and dozens wounded in Ukraine. Let's welcome Dr. Jenny Mathers, senior lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University and an expert on Russian politics and security. Dr. Jenny Mathers, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Ukraine seem to be making, progress for their part with their incursion and the mission for them to go into Belgorod. Yet these Russian strikes are doing a lot of damage to Ukrainian infrastructure. Where do you put their victory plan at the moment? Is it at risk of losing momentum, or are they going headfirst regardless?
Well, I think what we're seeing is very typical of the patterns that we have seen in terms of how Russia responds to any sort of reverses on the battlefield. Russia hasn't really found much of a response to Ukraine's incursion into Russian territory. They haven't really, identified a collection of forces to put against the Ukrainians. They've mainly responded with conscripts. They really haven't tried hard to push them away. On the other hand, they have redoubled and increased the ferocity of attacks on civilian targets. And this is exactly what we've seen in the past. We've seen, over the last 2.5 years, this is Russia's major response to any issues that it faces. I think, Ukraine has a lot of challenges that it's trying to address. And part of the point of this incursion into Russian territory seems to have been take the war to Russia, make it clear to Russia that it has, it has a cost to bear, change the dynamics, change the narrative, but also to create a different reality on the ground. Because what we've often heard from Russian sources, but also from outsiders who've been looking at the prospects for peace or a ceasefire, is that any sort of a peace agreement would have to take account of reality on the ground, i.e. that Russia occupies space in Ukraine. And so now, of course, Ukraine is occupying space in Russia. So it's a different sort of a reality. Now, the big question, I think, for Ukraine is how much support is it going to get from its Western allies? And this is precisely why, Zelensky wants to present a case directly to Biden. It's also probably why we're having a sort of NATO-Ukraine council meeting being called tomorrow. Now is really the time, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, for the West to really untie their hands, to allow them more flexibility and freedom, so that they can really, hit hard on some of these Russian military targets.
A couple of news lines from today. Ukraine's top general said that Ukraine had captured 594 Russian servicemen during its operation over the past few weeks in the Kursk region. Ukraine's captured 100 settlements, they said. And in a press conference today, just leaning into what you've just said there, really, about military support, Zelensky revealing today that Ukraine had tested its first domestically produced ballistic missile. Also said that Ukraine had the ability to produce 1.5 to 2 meter drones this year, but currently lacks the funding to do so. What do we know about that domestically produced ballistic missile? This could be really important for Ukraine.
Yeah, so it's being described as sort of a cross between a missile and a drone, whatever that means. And it's being said to have a range of around 700 kilometers, which gives it, some very considerable distance that it can travel. I think, Ukraine has increasingly throughout this war been turning more and more to its own domestic ingenuity and production. We've seen that with drones really extensively. The drones that have wreaked such havoc on Russia's Black Sea Fleet, for example, but other drones which are sort of striking targets in occupied Ukraine, but also behind the lines in Russia. So I think it's sort of the next level, and we have had reports that this new missile stroke drone was actually used over the weekend against a target in Russian occupied Ukraine, although that's as much detail as we've seen. So it clearly exists. It's been used at least once. There's questions about how many of them Ukraine has and how quickly they can produce them. And so this is where, capacity issues come in and finance issues come in. I think, but what we've seen is that Ukraine has a really quite unique sort of military industry, which involves a partnership between private business, civil society, and also government to try and fill some of the gaps in its weapons and its ammunition, and to come up with really creative solutions to the problems that it's facing.
All right, Jenny, always fascinating to speak to you. Thank you so much. Dr. Jenny Mathers there, Senior Lecturer in International Politics at Aberystwyth University, an expert on Russian politics and security. Speak to you again soon, Jenny. Thank you.